I used to think that old age came quietly, like the evening twilight, which at first was almost unnoticeable, and then suddenly you realized the day had already passed. It seemed to me that she simply sat down next to me, put her hand on my shoulder, and began to breathe in the same rhythm as me. But old age came differently. It came in words, foreign, sharp, and it remained inside me as a resonant echo that hasn't died down yet. After my husband died, the house became too big. It hadn't changed, the same walls, the same curtains that I washed every spring, the same creaking floorboards by the window. But everything in it seemed to have receded from me, as if I had become a superfluous object that someone had forgotten to take out but had already mentally marked as unnecessary. I walked through the room slowly, not because my legs ached, but because I didn't know where to go anymore. Before, every corner had a meaning. Now there were only memories. His mug was still sitting in the kitchen, with a small blue crack on the side. I hadn't washed it on purpose. I felt like if it disappeared, he would disappear too, completely, without a trace. Sometimes I'd sit at the table across from the empty chair and talk out loud about the weather, about how bread had gotten more expensive, about my heart, which was aching at night. I'd speak quietly, almost in a whisper, as if he might be sleeping in the next room and I was afraid to wake him. My daughter called often, too often. There was concern in her voice, but underneath it, there was tension, like a draft from a loose window. She'd ask if I'd eaten, if I'd taken my pills, if I was warm. And then, almost casually, she'd start talking about how hard it was for me alone, that at my age I couldn't be left unattended, that she and her husband had space, and I'd feel safer with family. I listened and nodded, though she couldn't see it. I was afraid to admit, even to myself, that I didn't want to leave. Home was the last thing that connected me to my old life. But one night, when I woke up with a sharp pain in my chest and sat on my bed for a long time, pressing my hand to my heart and counting my breaths, fear proved stronger than stubbornness. In the morning, I called my daughter myself and told her she was probably right. Her voice immediately became lighter, as if she'd been waiting for these words for a long time. It took me a long time to pack. Not because there were so many things, but because each one had to be handled carefully like a wound. An old blanket under which we watched TV. Photos of us when we were young, not knowing how much lay ahead. I took only the essentials, but still, the suitcase felt heavy, as if it held not things but years. My daughter's house greeted me with the scent of someone else's life. Everything here was correct, modern, and neat. A bright kitchen, smooth walls, furniture without a single scratch. They immediately showed me my room, small but clean. "You'll be comfortable here," my daughter said and smiled. I smiled too, trying not to show how much I longed to get back to my creaky, oversized house. My son-in-law barely spoke to me the first few days. He nodded politely, said hello, and occasionally asked how I was feeling. But there was something wary in his gaze, as if he was constantly calculating how much space I was taking up, how much noise I was making, how much trouble I was causing. I tried to be inconspicuous. I got up early, cleaned up after myself, and ate little so as not to disturb anyone. Old people have a way of becoming small when they feel they're in the way. I received my pension at the beginning of the month. It wasn't much, but it was always enough. I was used to counting pennies, saving, and not spending unnecessarily. At first, no one mentioned them, and I almost believed everything would be fine. But one evening, When my daughter had gone to the store and my son-in-law and I were alone in the kitchen, he sat down across from me and folded his hands on the table. The movement was slow, deliberate, and it made me uneasy. He started from a distance, speaking calmly, without raising his voice. He said that times were hard, that expenses had risen, that more people were living in the building. Then he looked straight at me and uttered a phrase that I'll never forget. He said it would be fair if I contributed my pension to the general budget since I was living with them now. And he added almost casually that otherwise perhaps I should think about somewhere else. I sat and stared at the pattern on the tablecloth. My heart was beating so loudly that it seemed he could hear it too. I felt ashamed, not because of the money, because I suddenly felt less like a mother and more like a grandmother, but like a tenant being forced to live under pressure. I couldn't find the words right away. There was a lump in my throat and one thought was spinning in my head. So that's it. This is what my old age looks like. When my daughter returned, the conversation was already over. I didn't say anything to her, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to be the cause of a fight. I went to my room and sat on the bed for a long time, looking out the window. Outside, the rain was falling, quietly and steadily, and I suddenly wanted to cry like that, silently, so no one would notice. I hardly slept that night. I thought about how easily a person can become superfluous, even among loved ones, about how quickly caring turns into calculation, and about how perhaps the most terrible thing about old age is not loneliness, but the moment when you are made to understand that your place here is temporary and conditional. After that conversation, I began to live more quietly. I'd always tried to be unnoticeable, but now it had become almost a craft. I moved around the house like a shadow, trying not to touch anything, not to leave a trace, not to irritate anyone. It seemed to me that every step I took was echoing in my son-in-law's mind. How much was I worth? How much was I eating? How much warmth was I taking from this house? I began getting up even earlier than before. I tiptoed into the kitchen, put the kettle on, and listened to the water slowly boil. The sound was calming. It was honest, unlike words. I drank tea without sugar, saving, though I knew it wasn't a matter of pennies. It was a feeling of being constantly reminded that I was here on terms. My daughter pretended nothing was happening. She was busy with work, fatigue, and her own worries. Sometimes I caught her looking at me, worried, but quickly averted. I thought she felt something, but was afraid to ask. And I was afraid to answer, because if I said it out loud, it would become final. I'd have to choose. And I had nothing to choose. I gave away my pension. Not right away. For a few days, I carried the money in my wallet as if it could protect me. But one morning, my son-in-law simply reminded me, calmly, without pressure, and that made it even more painful. I silently placed the envelope on the table. He thanked me, politely. It's not the way you thank family, but those who fulfill a commitment. From that day on, something inside me broke. Not loudly, without tears. It simply felt empty. I stopped feeling part of the family. I became a function, an addition, an old piece of furniture that still serves, but no longer pleases the eye. I thought more and more about my home. Not the home itself, but the feeling that I was the mistress there, even alone. There, no one counted my steps or weighed my usefulness. There, I could be weak and have nothing to prove to anyone. Here, every minute felt like it was being tested. One day, I heard my son-in-law talking on the phone. He didn't know I was in the hallway. He was talking about money, about hardships, about how old people live long lives these days, but they're of little use. I stopped and couldn't move a step. His words weren't addressed to me directly, but they sank right into my heart. I stood there, holding onto the wall, and suddenly realized that to him, I wasn't even human. I was an expense item. That evening, my blood pressure spiked. I sat on my bed, holding the pills in my hand, thinking that if I got worse, I wouldn't even know who to tell. I became afraid to ask for help, afraid of being an even bigger burden. I started thinking about the future, not the distant future, about tomorrow, about what would happen if I got sicker, if I became completely helpless. The thoughts were heavy, sticky, like autumn fog. I pushed them away, but they kept coming back. Sometimes my daughter would sit next to me and talk about work, her plans, some little detail. I listened and smiled, but inside I felt cold. I didn't know how to tell her the truth without ruining her life. She was between me and her husband, and I didn't want her to choose. Mothers shouldn't demand sacrifices from their children. But silence also turned out to be a choice against oneself. Sometimes life brings small surprises. Link in the description. One night, I couldn't bear it and burst into tears, quietly into my pillow, so no one would hear. I cried not from resentment, but from exhaustion, from the fact that I had lived a long life, raised a daughter, loved, endured, hoped, and ultimately found myself in a position where my dignity was measured by the sum in an envelope. In the morning, I looked at myself in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman in the reflection. My eyes grew dull. My shoulders slumped. I suddenly realized that if this continued, I would disappear. Not physically, internally. And then no roof over my head would matter anymore. That day, I made a decision. A quiet one, without loud words. I decided to reclaim myself, even if it was painful, even if it was scary. But I could no longer live feeling like my right to exist needed to be reaffirmed every month. I didn't yet know how exactly I would do it. I didn't know where I would go or what I would say. But for the first time in a long time, not only pain but also a weak, almost imperceptible spark appeared inside me. Hope. The one that doesn't scream, but simply doesn't let itself go completely. The solution didn't come to me all at once, like in books, when the hero suddenly understands everything at once and takes action. My decision was born slowly, almost imperceptibly, like dawn, which at first only slightly brightens the edge of the sky, and only then does it become clear that the night is over. I simply woke up one day and felt that I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't live as if I were asking permission for every day. I sat on the bed and listened to the house. It no longer seemed warm to me. There were many sounds in it, footsteps, doors, dishes, but none of them were addressed to me. I realized that I didn't belong here, not because I was being kicked out, but because I wasn't welcome here. And this realization turned out to be the most painful. Sometimes life brings small surprises. Link in the description. I thought about my daughter for a long time, about how she grew up, how I held her hand when she took her first steps, how I worried about every cold, every tear. I never thought that one day money would come between us. Not because she's bad, but because life sometimes quietly forces compromises on people, and they don't immediately realize what they're losing. That day, I decided to talk to her. Not to complain, not to blame, just to tell the truth. I waited for the moment when we would be alone, and my heart pounded as if I were young again and afraid to admit something important. When she sat down across from me, I saw weariness in her eyes, and love, and fear, all at once. I spoke slowly, with pauses. The words came hard, but I tried not to cry. I told her about that conversation, about money, about how it had become hard to breathe in this house. I said I didn't want to be a burden, that my presence didn't cause tension. I said it hurt me to feel superfluous. My daughter listened silently. Her face changed, and I saw her finally grasp what she had been trying to ignore for so long. She began to cry, quietly, like an adult, not like a child cries. She said she hadn't known things had gone this far, that she thought I just needed to get used to it. She said she loved me. I believed her. But love unprotected by actions can sometimes prove too fragile. The conversation with my son-in-law was short. He was surprised, irritated. He spoke of rationality, of how everyone in the family should contribute, that he hadn't hurt anyone. I listened and suddenly realized I was no longer angry. There was no anger left in me, only fatigue and clarity. I told him I'd take my things and leave. Not because he was bad, but because I could no longer live where my dignity was discussed like an expense item. I packed calmly, without tears. Each item fit into my bag like a period in a long sentence of my life. My daughter helped me, and much remained unsaid between us. But a cautiousness appeared in her movements, as if she were afraid of hurting me again. I returned to my house. It greeted me with coldness and silence, but this silence was different. Honest. It didn't oppress. I opened the windows, let in the air, and suddenly felt something inside me unfold. Yes, I was alone, but I was myself, unconditionally, without demands. The first few days were difficult. The fear returned at night. The money was small, but every morning I woke up feeling like I belonged to myself again. I decided when to get up, what to eat, what to think about. And this turned out to be more important than comfort. Over time, I found the strength to get my life back on track. I met a neighbor who was just as lonely as I was. We drank tea and talked about the past, not regretting it, but remembering it. I started going for walks, noticing the sky, the people, the little things that had previously passed me by. Life hadn't become easy, but it was mine again. My daughter came to visit, cautiously at first, then more often. Warmth gradually returned between us, but without illusions. I no longer lived for comfort, and perhaps this is what restored my respect. I realized one simple thing. Old age is not a time when you have nothing. It is a time when you are left with what matters most: dignity, memory, and the right to choose, even if the choice is difficult. Now I live slowly, not because I can't move faster, but because I'm no longer in a hurry to prove my right to exist. Morning comes to me earlier than to others. I wake before dawn, when the room is just beginning to light up, and the world seems to pause before continuing its noisy day. I lie and listen to the clock ticking. This sound used to frighten me. It reminded me of time passing. Now it seems comforting. As long as the clock ticks, I exist. I make tea, with the same old kettle. It whistles, as if alive, and I smile. My habits have returned to the house. My smells, my rhythm. I again leave my mug where it suits me, not where it's right. And in these little things, I feel more alive than at any time in recent years. Sometimes I still feel sad. I won't say the pain is gone completely. It doesn't go away. It just becomes quieter, like an old melody you know by heart. Sometimes I think back to that day when I put the envelope with my pension on the table, and it feels like it didn't happen to me. Like it was some other woman. Too submissive. Too scared. Too ready to disappear, just so she wouldn't bother anyone. I'm not like that anymore. And it's not about pride. It's about self-respect. My daughter comes to visit me on weekends. We drink tea and talk about simple things. Sometimes silence hangs between us, but it's no longer oppressive. There's no guilt in this silence. There's acceptance. She's become more attentive. I see it not in her words, but in the way she looks at me, the way she listens, the way she doesn't interrupt. We don't go back to the previous conversation. We no longer need to repeat it. Everything has already been said. Everything has already been understood. My son-in-law greets me politely, evenly, without unnecessary words. There's no tension between us anymore, but there's no intimacy either. And I'm okay with that. Not everyone has to be close to each other. Sometimes it's enough for them to be honest and not overstep their boundaries. I've learned to appreciate the little things. A spot of sunlight on the wall, the smell of fresh bread, a stranger's random smile. I used to think that happiness was being held close. Now I know. Happiness is not being forced to be less than you are. In the evenings, I sit by the window and watch the lights come on. Different destinies live in these windows. Young, tired, happy, lost. And I suddenly realize that my life still goes on. Not as a wait, but as a journey. Slow, calm, meaning. Sometimes I talk to my husband. Everything is the same. Quietly, without complaints. I tell him how my day went, how the neighbor brought a pie, how my daughter laughed at some trivial thing. I think he would understand. He would say I did everything right. And that's enough for me. I'm no longer afraid of being alone. Loneliness is no longer a void. It's become space. Space where I can breathe, remember, feel. Where I don't have to justify my age, my years, my fatigue. If someone asks me now what's most important in old age, I won't answer right away. I'll think. I'll pause. And then I'll say, the most important thing is to never let anyone take away your value. Not for money. Not for a roof over your head. Not for the illusion of care. I've lived a long life. I've made mistakes. Ever forgiven. Ever endured. And now I simply live. Quietly. Truly. With a hope that doesn't scream, but warms from within. And that, turns out, is quite enough.